$23 million. That's what arrogance costs you when you pick a fight with the wrong farmer. This is not a story about a Reddit argument. This is a story about a multi-billion-dollar corporation that decided, deliberately, callously, and with the confidence of people who have never been told no, to destroy the family farm that built their empire, and how that family farm burned them to the ground. If you've ever eaten sriracha, you know the bottle, the rooster, the green cap, the sauce that went from a niche condiment to a global phenomenon in the span of about a decade. What you probably don't know is where those peppers came from. For over 30 years, one family of farmers supplied the majority of the chili peppers used in Huy Fong's sriracha sauce. One family, one farm, generations of agricultural expertise, years of perfecting the hybrid jalapeno variety that gave sriracha its signature heat and flavor. The relationship wasn't just transactional, it was foundational, with those specific peppers grown in a specific region, harvested at a specific time, processed in a specific way. The sauce doesn't taste the same. The farmer wasn't a vendor. He was the backbone, the roots beneath the empire. And the corporation knew it. They just didn't care. Here's how it started. For decades, this arrangement worked on trust, a handshake, a verbal agreement between a farmer and a sauce maker, the kind of deal that gets made over a kitchen table, sealed with eye contact and the shared understanding that both parties need each other. The farmer grew the peppers, the company bought them. Everyone prospered. But as the company grew, as sriracha went from a condiment to a cultural icon, from a regional product to a global brand worth hundreds of millions, the dynamics shifted. The company started looking at the numbers differently. New people sat in the offices, people who hadn't been there for the handshake, people who'd never walked the rows of pepper plants at dawn or felt the dust of the harvest settle on their skin. The farmer's share started looking like a line item that could be reduced. The CEO, the company's founder, the man who had built his empire on this farmer's peppers, began distancing himself from the relationship. The warmth evaporated. The phone calls got shorter. The conversation shifted from partnership to procurement. From, how's the crop this year, to we need to discuss pricing adjustments. They began pressuring the farmer on price, renegotiating terms that had been stable for years, suggesting that perhaps the peppers could be sourced elsewhere, that perhaps the farmer's services weren't as essential as he thought. This is the part of the story where you need to understand something about corporate psychology. When a company reaches a certain size, it develops a kind of institutional amnesia. The people making decisions today weren't there when the handshake happened. They don't know the farmer's name. They don't know his father's name. They see a spreadsheet, and on that spreadsheet the farmer is an expense that can be optimized. The company didn't just reduce the farmer's margins, they waged a campaign. They planted hundreds of acres of their own chili peppers, trying to replicate what the farmer had spent decades perfecting, trying to cut out the middleman, except the middleman was the person who created the product they were selling, the person whose knowledge of soil composition, water timing, harvest windows, and seed selection was not something you could replicate with a few agronomists and some venture capital. They contested loads, rejected shipments, found quality issues where none existed. Peppers that had been perfectly acceptable for 20 years were suddenly failing inspections. Classic corporate supplier warfare. Death by 1,000 paper cuts, designed to make the relationship so unbearable that the farmer walks away, and the company claims they were forced to find alternatives. They delayed payments, extended terms, made the farmer float costs for weeks longer than agreed upon, knowing that a family operation runs on cash flow the way a body runs on blood. Starve the flow, and the body starts to fail. The farmer didn't walk away, because walking away would have meant abandoning 30 years of work. Millions of dollars in infrastructure, equipment that was designed specifically for this crop, for this buyer, for this relationship. Land that had been cultivated and conditioned over generations. Employees whose families depended on the harvest, families who lived in the same small towns, whose children went to the same schools, whose livelihoods were woven into the fabric of the farm. Instead, the farmer did something the corporation didn't expect. He lawyered up. When a generational farmer goes to war with a billion-dollar company, the conventional wisdom says the farmer loses, because the company has more lawyers, more resources, more stamina for a prolonged legal fight, more capacity to bleed the other side dry with motions and delays and depositions that stretch across years. But conventional wisdom didn't account for one thing. The farmer had the truth. He had records, decades of them, delivery logs, communication histories, documentation of every verbal agreement, every pricing conversation, every promise made and broken. He had the kind of paper trail that corporate legal teams pray their opponents don't have. The kind that a meticulous, detail-oriented generational farmer keeps, because that's what farmers do. They track everything. The weather, the yield, the soil pH, the buyer's word. And he had something else. He had the fact that the company's own internal communications, the emails, the memos, the strategy documents, revealed exactly what they'd been doing. Deliberately undermining a loyal supplier. Deliberately manufacturing pretexts to terminate the relationship. Deliberately attempting to steal the agricultural IP that had made their product possible. When those documents came to light, the courtroom shifted. Because this wasn't a David versus Goliath story where David gets lucky. This was a David versus Goliath story where David had a mountain of evidence, and Goliath had been arrogant enough to put their strategy in writing. $23 million. That's the number. That's what the court determined was owed to the farmer, not as a punishment, though it functioned as one, but as compensation for what the corporation had done. The breach of agreements, the destroyed crop revenue, the deliberate interference with a supplier relationship that had been profitable for 3 decades. 23 million. To a corporation that size, it's a rounding error, a bad quarter, a line item they'll write off and forget. But to a farmer, it was vindication. It was 30 years of loyalty, of waking up before dawn when the ground was still cold, of working soil with your hands until they're cracked and bled, and building something generational in a world that doesn't reward patience. Being recognized by a court of law as having value. Real, quantifiable, legally enforceable value. And to the executives who made the decision to squeeze the farmer, it was a lesson. A very expensive lesson in what happens when you treat human relationships as line items. When you mistake loyalty for weakness. When you assume that the person who built your foundation is too small to fight back. The financial penalty was only part of the damage. The lawsuit exposed the company's internal culture in a way that PR could never fully recover from. The public learned that this beloved, iconic brand had treated its most critical supplier with contempt, that the sauce millions of people keep in their refrigerator was built on the back of a farmer who was nearly destroyed by the company he helped create. The narrative shifted. Food bloggers, industry journalists, social media. The story of the farmer versus the corporation became a symbol of everything people hate about corporate greed. The company that had built its brand on authenticity, on being the scrappy immigrant success story, the sauce made with real peppers by real people, was exposed as operating like every other faceless corporation when it came to protecting its margins. The company's founder, the CEO who had personally benefited from 3 decades of the farmer's labor, watched his carefully crafted image fracture. The humble sauce maker narrative couldn't survive the revelation that he'd tried to crush the man who made his success possible. The farmer's reputation, meanwhile, grew. He became a folk hero of sorts, the man who fought the machine and won. Not because he was more powerful, but because he was right, and because he had the patience and the documentation to prove it. This story resonates because it touches something primal. Everyone has worked for someone who didn't value them. Everyone has experienced the gut punch of loyalty being repaid with indifference. Everyone knows what it feels like to be reduced to a number on a spreadsheet by someone who has never seen your face or shaken your hand, or watched you work. The farmer's story is universal. It's the restaurant owner squeezed by a delivery platform. It's the freelancer ghosted after months of work. It's the employee whose 20 years of service earns them a 30-day severance in a cardboard box. It's every person who ever gave their best to someone who saw their best at something to extract, not something to honor. But what makes this version special, what makes it worth telling on this channel, is that the farmer won. Not a moral victory, not a I held my head high victory. A $23 million court-ordered, legally binding victory. The kind of victory where the people who wronged you have to write a check. The kind of victory that exists on paper and cannot be disputed, revised, or spun by a public relations team. The kind of victory that makes you sit back in your chair and think. Sometimes the system works. Sometimes the truth is loud enough to be heard over the money. Sometimes the small guy wins not because the world is fair, but because the small guy was too stubborn, too principled, and too well documented to be silenced. The farmer is still farming. His land is still producing. The knowledge that was passed down through generations, the specific techniques for growing the specific peppers that built a global brand, still lives in his hands and in his soil. The corporation is still selling sauce, still profitable, still on shelves in every grocery store in America. But something changed. The relationship that built the brand is severed, and whatever the company grows on its own land, in its own fields with its own techniques, it's not quite the same. Because you can replicate a pepper. You can analyze soil composition and water schedules and harvest timing. But you can't replicate 30 years of dedication from a man who loved what he grew. You can't grow that in a corporate field. You can't hire it. You can't optimize it. You can't replicate the pride of a man who watches the sun come up over rows he planted with his own hands. You can't engineer the intuition of someone who can tell by the color of a leaf whether the harvest needs another day. You can't download 30 years of relationship with the land into a corporate playbook. Some things can't be optimized. Some expenses are actually investments. And some farmers fight back. 23 million. Was it enough? Or should the penalty for destroying a generational business be even higher? And have you ever been the farmer in this story? The person who gave everything to someone who treated you like you were disposable. I want to hear it. Drop it in the comments.